A black soldier just returned from deployment. Ready to finally go home. But everything changes the moment he steps into the airport. He had served his country with honor. Spent months overseas in conditions most people couldn't imagine. And now, all he wanted was to board his flight and go home. But the moment he set foot in the airport, everything took a dark turn. A security officer, one who should have been there to protect and serve, zeroed in on him without cause. What started as a random check quickly turned into public humiliation. Passengers watched as he was interrogated, searched, and treated like a threat, even though he had done nothing wrong. His uniform, his service, his sacrifice, none of it mattered in that moment. But just 7 minutes later, everything flipped. A revelation no one saw coming left the officer speechless. And before the soldier even reached his gate, the officer was fired on the spot. What happened next set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. And proved once again that justice has a way of finding its moment. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary day at the airport, until it wasn't. The airport was alive with movement. A river of people flowing toward different destinies. Businessmen in pressed suits. Families tugging along weary children. Young lovers saying hurried goodbyes. Each wrapped in their own small world. Each believing, in some way, that the space belonged to them. Sergeant Naomi Carter knew better. She moved through the terminal with the quiet assurance of a woman accustomed to navigating spaces that were not built with her in mind. The uniform she wore, olive green, crisp despite the journey, was a shield and a burden. It told a story before she could speak, and demanded a certain level of respect from those who understood its meaning. But respect, like dignity, was a currency not evenly distributed in America. The first test came at security. The line was long. Bodies shifting impatiently as TSA agents waved passengers through metal detectors. Naomi had done this countless times before. She knew the routine. Yet, as she stepped forward, the agent, a young white man with a tight-lipped expression and an even tighter grip on power, gave her the kind of look she had seen all her life. A look that asked a silent question. "Why are you here?" She handed over her ID. He studied it for longer than necessary, flipping it between his fingers. His expression unreadable. Then, just as she expected, "Step aside, ma'am." Random screening. A part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Random. That word, so carefully chosen, so sterile in its attempt to disguise intent. Naomi exhaled, steady, and moved toward the designated area. The pat-down was thorough. Too thorough. Hands pressed against her arms. Her waist. The curve of her spine. Her legs. She had been through security hundreds of times before. But this felt different. This felt personal. A white woman in yoga pants breezed past with a smile. Barely a glance in her direction. A businessman, silver-haired and oblivious, waltzed through, belt still around his waist. Shoes still snug on his feet. The rules bent for some. They tightened for others. When they finally waved her through, Naomi reclaimed her bag with the quiet dignity she had perfected long ago. The first battle had been small, but it had been won. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and moved toward the ticket counter. The second test came at the check-in desk. Naomi approached, her boarding pass already in hand. She knew what was waiting for her. A first-class upgrade her family had gifted her as a welcome home present. A seat, not in the back, not crammed between restless passengers, but in the front, where space stretched out and comfort was not rationed like a wartime necessity. Behind the counter, David Langston stood like a sentinel. His uniform crisp, his expression impatient. He was a man who had spent too long deciding who belonged where. She handed over her ticket. "I believe I have an upgrade to first class," she said, voice even, polite. Langston barely glanced at her before his fingers moved over the keyboard. His expression shifted. Something tightened in his jaw. "There's no record of an upgrade." Naomi blinked. A pause. A hesitation. "I'm sure my family purchased it," she said, measured, careful not to let the frustration creep into her tone. Could you check again? Langston's eyes flicked up, and this time he looked at her. Really looked. The uniform, the black skin, the steady posture that didn't shrink under scrutiny. Then came the words. Clipped. Precise. Each one sharper than the last. First class is for paying customers. Not military handouts. There it was. The air between them thickened. Naomi felt the shift, not just in the moment, but in the weight of something larger. Something older than either of them. It wasn't about the ticket. It was never about the ticket. She had seen this script before. Played this role too many times. The soldier, the outsider, the one who had to prove, again and again, that she belonged in the spaces others walked through without thought. She could have fought. She could have raised her voice. Demanded a supervisor. Made a scene. But there was no victory in that. Not today. So she did the only thing she could. She swallowed. Took the coach ticket he pushed back toward her with those same tight fingers. And said, with just the right amount of steel in her voice. Thank you. She turned before she could see his reaction. Before she could give him the satisfaction of watching her break. The second battle had been lost. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. As she walked toward her gate, she passed the first-class lounge. The doors opened just enough for her to see the world inside. Plush chairs, soft lighting, passengers with cocktails in their hands and ease in their posture. A world where comfort was expected, not earned. Naomi kept walking. She had spent her entire life walking past doors that were never meant to open for her. But history had a way of changing. And sooner or later, the door would break wide open. The weight of the moment sat in Naomi Carter's chest like an old, familiar stone. She had held it before. Carried it through streets lined with silent stares. Through rooms where conversations hushed at her presence. Through meetings where decisions were already made before she spoke. She had been here before. But something about this day, this place, this fight, it felt heavier. She walked toward her gate. Her coach ticket crumpled slightly in her grip. The imprint of David Langston's rejection still fresh on it. Still fresh on her. She wanted to believe it was about the seat. About a mistake. A clerical error. Some minor inconvenience that could happen to anyone. But she knew better. Some mistakes only happen to certain people. The boarding process had begun. First-class passengers moved through the priority line. Without hesitation. Without friction. They belonged here. And then there was Naomi. A soldier. A woman who had walked through war zones with less fear than she felt in this moment. Now standing in line behind them. Waiting to board an airplane that, for all its steel and machinery, still held the invisible walls of an older world. She stepped forward, one foot after the other. Her movements steady, controlled. And then, there it was. The walk through first class. The first reminder came in the form of a look. She barely stepped past the threshold of the cabin when she felt it. A sudden, sharp awareness of herself, of the uniform on her back, of the space she occupied. An older white woman in row 2A looked up from her tablet. Her eyes narrowing just slightly before returning to her screen. As if to confirm that whatever had just entered her periphery wasn't worth her attention. A middle-aged man in seat 1B, dressed in a navy blazer and slacks, shifted in his chair, his elbow moving just enough to protect his armrest. His fingers flexed slightly against his whiskey glass, as though bracing himself. The quiet tension in their expressions was something beyond curiosity. It was something she recognized. Something she had seen before. Who let her in here? Naomi kept walking. The second reminder came in the form of a hesitation. Halfway through the first-class cabin, she noticed a flight attendant standing near the galley. A blonde woman, polished, the kind who made even the rigid airline uniform look like it had been tailored to fit her just so. Their eyes met. It was only for a second. But in that second, Naomi saw the flicker of doubt. The slight hesitation in the woman's step. The almost imperceptible pause before she parted her lips. It was the kind of pause that said, "Do you belong here?" The attendant didn't speak. She didn't stop Naomi. But the hesitation was enough. Naomi didn't break her stride. The third reminder came in the form of words. She was almost past the first-class section when she heard it. A voice. Low. Male. Casual but firm. "Excuse me, miss." Naomi turned. The voice belonged to a white man in his 60s. Well-dressed. The kind of face that had spent decades giving orders and having them followed without question. Man, Indiana 3C. Think you're headed in the wrong direction. His voice wasn't aggressive. No. It was something worse. It sure was. There was no question in his tone. No room for the possibility that she might, in fact, know exactly where she was going. The assumption was simple. If she was here, she would be lost. For a moment, Naomi considered responding. She could have told him who she was. Could have recited her rank, her service record, the battles she had fought, the medals she had earned. Could have told him that she was here because her family had given her a gift. A moment of comfort. Something so simple and yet, apparently, so unimaginable. But then she thought of David Langston at the counter. She thought of the security agent who took too long with her ID. She thought of all the times she had already explained herself today, in ways that others never had to. And so, she simply said, "No, I'm not." And she walked on. The final reminder came in the form of absence. She reached the coach, her assigned seat waiting like an old punishment. Row 24C. Here, the seats were closer together. Tighter, harder. A physical reminder of the invisible class divisions that still shaped every corner of this country. She lowered herself into the seat, adjusting her duffel bag at her feet. Around her, passengers shifted, packed shoulder to shoulder, their bodies forced into uncomfortable proximity. She let out a slow breath, pressing herself into the seat, willing her mind to quiet. But she could still hear his voice. Think you're headed in the wrong direction. How many times had she been told that? In different ways? How many doors had she walked through, only to be told she did not belong? How many spaces had she entered, only to feel the air shift around her presence? She had spent her entire life walking past first-class cabins. And today, even with the ticket in her hands, she had been forced to do it again. Naomi clenched her jaw. The uniform on her back. The country she had served. The blood and sweat and time she had given. None of it had been enough to keep her from this seat. And yet, her father had fought these same battles before her. She closed her eyes. Some wars never end, but one day, she would win. The hum of the airplane settled into a dull, steady vibration, a kind of mechanical heartbeat beneath the voices and movements of passengers finding their places. The weight of the day pressed against Sergeant Naomi Carter's chest, heavier than the duffel bag at her feet. She had been prepared for a long flight, but she had not prepared for this. For the suffocating reality that had followed her from the check-in counter, through the first-class cabin, and now into her cramped coach seat. She exhaled slowly, adjusting her posture, willing herself to ignore the way her knees pressed into the seat in front of her. The way the overhead air vent blasted too cold against her skin. This was not the first time Naomi had been forced into a smaller space. She had spent a lifetime learning to make herself fit. The first irritation came quickly. The man beside her, a balding white passenger in a wrinkled polo, took up more space than he should have. His elbow claimed the shared armrest immediately, his shoulder pressing slightly into Naomi's own. She had barely sat down before he sighed. A loud, exaggerated thing, and shifted away from her, as if his body had been forced into discomfort simply by her presence. Naomi didn't move. She had been here before, too. The second irritation followed soon after. A flight attendant, not Jasmine, but another one, white, young, professional, made her way down the aisle, checking seatbelts, offering pleasantries to passengers with easy smiles. But when she reached Naomi's row, she hesitated. It was a small thing, but Naomi caught it. The split-second pause before the woman turned to her with that look. The look that asked a silent question. "Can I help you?" Naomi had seen that look in department stores, in restaurants, in boardrooms where she had been the only one like herself in the room. The kind of look that suggested, no matter how politely, that she did not seem to belong. "I'm fine," Naomi said before the woman could speak. The flight attendant nodded too quickly, the doubt still lingering in her eyes, and moved on. Then came the third irritation, louder than the rest. Across the aisle, seat 25B, an older white man with gray hair and deep lines etched into his face. turned slightly toward Naomi. He had been watching her for some time. Naomi could feel it. Not blatantly, not openly hostile, but watching, nonetheless. And finally, as if he could no longer contain himself, he spoke. Army? His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that had given orders in its time. Naomi turned slightly, meeting his gaze. Yes, sir. He nodded slowly, taking her in, his eyes scanning her uniform, her posture, as if measuring something unseen. There was a beat of silence before he spoke again. You know, back in my day, soldiers knew their place. The words hung in the air, thick and deliberate. Naomi did not move. She did not ask what he meant. She already knew. His day, the world he spoke of, had been one where men like him sat in first class without question, while soldiers like her had fought for a country that would not fight for them in return. His day had been one where black pilots flew missions overseas only to come home to whites only signs. Where men like her father had been praised in wartime and denied dignity in peace. His day had been one where a black woman in a military uniform still had to prove herself to people who had done far less than she had. And now, here he was, on a plane bound for nowhere she cared about, reminding her that his world had not disappeared, only adjusted, only learned to whisper where it once shouted. Naomi took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. And what place was that? The man held her gaze for a long moment. But he did not answer. He only turned forward, adjusting his seatbelt, as if the conversation had never happened. But it had. Naomi could still feel it. She turned forward, too. Outside the small airplane window, the world was shrinking, the tarmac fading beneath them as the plane began its ascent. The rules of gravity were simple. What goes up must come down. But the rules of this country were different. Some people never had to fall. And some, like Naomi, had been made to climb from the very beginning. She leaned her head back against the seat, her mind already bracing for the next battle. Because there was always a next battle. The plane had reached its cruising altitude. The world below reduced to a patchwork of land and sky, distant and irrelevant to those confined in this steel cage of unspoken rules. Sergeant Naomi Carter sat in 24C, staring ahead, not at the screen on the seat in front of her, not at the passengers shifting in their discomfort, but into something deeper, something far older than this flight. She had spent a lifetime in places like this, tight spaces where she was both visible and invisible at once. She had thought, perhaps foolishly, that her uniform might shield her, that the weight of her service, the battles she had fought, the blood and sweat she had given to this country, might count for something here. But service had never been the thing that granted passage. Color was. And that truth sat beside her like an unwelcome passenger. The first test came in the form of a request. The flight attendant, the same young white woman who had hesitated before, returned. But this time, her voice was firmer, her demeanor more assured, as if she had made up her mind about something. Ma'am, we need to ask a favor. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting the woman's eyes. What is it? The attendant glanced toward the aisle, toward the front of the cabin where the first-class section was still wrapped in soft light and privilege. There's a passenger in first class who needs extra space. A medical issue. Would you be willing to switch to another seat in coach to help accommodate? Naomi felt the request before she heard it. She had seen the empty seats in first class as she walked through. There were spaces there, so why was the solution always to move her? Move her away. Move her aside, make her smaller. The air around them grew thick with expectation. She could feel it in the quiet eyes of the passengers nearby. In the way some of them pretended not to listen but had leaned in just slightly. She had a choice. She could move, she could shrink, she could do as they had always expected her to do. As black soldiers had done long before her. Serve, sacrifice, give up something for someone else's comfort. Or she could hold her ground. She straightened slightly, her voice calm, steady. I paid for this seat. The attendant blinked. Not a large reaction, not a sharp one, but a moment of surprise. Nonetheless, as if she had expected this to go differently. Of course, the woman said quickly, too quickly, I just thought, quote. Naomi let the words hang between them, unfinished. And then, just like that, The attendant gave a tight-lipped smile, one that did not reach her eyes, and moved on. No further request was made. No other passenger was asked. Naomi had passed the test. Or perhaps, she had failed it. The second test came not in words, but in silence. The man beside her, the balding white passenger who had taken the armrest without thought, now cleared his throat. A small, insignificant sound. But then came another, and another. She could feel it, the way his posture had shifted, the way his arms tightened slightly, as if her refusal to move had somehow made her presence beside him intolerable. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. He looked away, but the discomfort remained. She had not done anything. She had not spoken out of turn, had not raised her voice, had not broken any rule except the unspoken one. The rule that said she was supposed to be agreeable, be accommodating, be grateful, and yet, she had chosen herself over their expectations. And that, to them, was offensive enough. The third test came from across the aisle. The old white man in 25B, the one who had told her that soldiers used to know their place, was watching her again, but this time, his expression had changed. He had been measuring her before. Now, he had decided, things sure are different these days. He muttered. It wasn't directed at her. Not exactly. But it reached her all the same. Naomi let the words settle. She could have ignored them. But she had spent too long swallowing words that were never meant to be digested. She turned, just slightly, her voice soft but unyielding. Different how? The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected silence. Instead, she had asked him to be honest. And the truth was, he didn't want to be. Because to say it outright would be to admit what he really meant. That he resented what he saw. A black woman in uniform. A black woman who had walked through first class even though she was not meant to. A black woman who had refused to move, to bow, to shrink, even when asked nicely. The old man shifted in his seat. And for the first time since she had boarded this plane, Naomi felt something shift in her favor. Because now, he was the one who looked uncomfortable. The plane continued forward, cutting through the sky, moving toward a destination that felt farther than ever. Naomi exhaled, slow and controlled. She had won these battles before. But winning did not mean the war was over. It only meant the next fight was waiting. And she would be ready. The cabin had settled into a restless quiet. The kind that filled spaces where people refused to acknowledge the weight in the air. The plane moved steadily forward, carrying its passengers across the sky. But something had already landed. Something Naomi Carter had felt before. In too many places. In too many ways. She could feel it in the stiff posture of the man beside her. In the way the old man in 25B kept shifting in his seat. In the way the flight attendant didn't look her in the eye anymore. She could feel it because it was always there. Just beneath the surface. The unspoken rule had been broken. She had been asked, no, expected, to give up her seat. She had refused. She had been reminded, subtly, that the world worked a certain way. That difference was expected. Accommodation required. And when she did not yield, when she did not apologize for her own presence, the plane did not fall out of the sky. But something else did. The illusion that these people, this country, this world had changed. The first blow came in a whisper. Naomi didn't hear the words at first. But she saw the way the man beside her leaned toward the aisle. Turning slightly, speaking low to the white woman across from him. She saw the way the woman's lips pressed together tightly. Like a secret had been passed between them. She didn't have to hear the words to know what had been said. She had seen this exchange before. In boardrooms, on sidewalks, in diners where she had walked in and watched laughter die mid-sentence as soon as she approached. It was a quiet kind of violence. The kind that never left bruises but left you marked all the same. The second blow came in exclusion. The flight attendant, not Jasmine, but the other one, the one who had hesitated before asking her to move, returned down the aisle with the drink cart. Would you like anything? She asked the white man in 25B. Her voice warm, friendly, the way it had been with the other passengers. The man asked for whiskey. On the house, the flight attendant said, smiling. She moved to the woman across from Naomi, the one who had exchanged glances with the man in 24B. Another drink, another nod, another small kindness given without hesitation. And then, without even looking at Naomi, the flight attendant pushed the cart forward. No question, no offer, not even a glance. Naomi watched the cart move away. She could have called out, could have demanded what was hers, just as she had done before. But she did not, because this was not about a drink. It was about something older than this moment. Something deeper than thirst. It was about erasure. The power in making someone feel invisible. The third blow came in the form of a voice she did not expect. Naomi had been staring at the small window beside her seat, watching the clouds stretch endless into the horizon. When she heard it, a soft voice. "Excuse me." She turned. It was the young black flight attendant. Jasmine. She was crouched slightly, her voice low, careful, as if weighing how much she could say, how much she could risk. "I saw what happened." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly against her thigh. She had not been looking for an ally. She had stopped looking for them a long time ago. But Jasmine's voice carried something Naomi had not heard today. Recognition. Understanding. A quiet anger buried beneath careful restraint. "I checked your ticket," Jasmine continued. "The first-class upgrade was in the system. They just never processed it." A slow, steady breath left Naomi's lips. She had known. Of course. She had known from the moment Langston's lips curled at the counter. From the moment he had spoken of military handouts. From the moment she had walked through first class and felt the air grow colder around her. The rejection had never been about logistics. It had been about who deserved comfort and who did not. It had been about power. The final blow came by choice. Jasmine's voice lowered even more. "I can move you now," she said. Naomi felt the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. The offer was there, a seat in first class. The luxury that had been denied to her. The apology that would never come in words, but only in quiet gestures. She could take it. She could gather her bag, stand up, walk back through the first-class cabin with her head high. She could reclaim what had been taken. But then, she thought of Langston at the counter. She thought of the old man in 25B. Of the white passengers who had pretended not to listen but had heard everything. She thought of how easy it would be for them to convince themselves that this had never happened at all. Because if she stood now, if she walked to first class now, then they would say, "See, it worked out in the end." They would forget the hesitation at the check-in desk. They would forget the request to move. They would forget the whispers. The omission. The small, deliberate ways in which they had told her she did not belong. Naomi exhaled. And then, with a voice as steady as stone, she shook her head. "No." Jasmine blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "I appreciate it," Naomi said, voice quiet but firm. "But I'll stay right here." Jasmine hesitated, but then she nodded, understanding settling between them like an unspoken truth. Naomi turned forward again. She did not need first class. Because the truth was, this seat had never been the thing she was fighting for. She was fighting for something bigger. For dignity. For memory. For the truth of what had happened here today. So that no one could ever pretend it had not. She sat back. And for the first time in hours, she felt taller than the sky. The air in the cabin had changed. It was not something spoken. It never was. But Naomi Carter could feel it. The weight of eyes that pretended not to see her. The tension that curled in the bodies around her. The space that had become smaller not because the walls had moved, but because the people had. She had made a choice. She had refused to move. Not to first class. Not out of their way. Not into the shape they wanted her to take. And that refusal had shifted something. She had not raised her voice. She had not called for justice. She had simply said, no. And still, they resented her for it. The first consequence came in the form of silence. The flight attendant, the one who had skipped over her before, the one who had looked at her as if she were nothing more than a misplaced inconvenience, returned with the drink cart. But she did not look at Naomi. She did not acknowledge her presence. Instead, she leaned over Naomi to hand a drink to the white man beside her. brushing past her shoulder as if she were nothing more than a shadow in the seat. Naomi did not flinch. She did not react. She had long since learned that some people would rather pretend she did not exist than confront the truth of her presence. The second consequence came in the form of small, sharp movements. The man beside her shifted in his seat. Again, and again. It was no longer subtle. Now, he sighed audibly. Now he leaned toward the aisle. Away from her. Now he pressed his hand to his temple like he had suddenly developed a headache that, in some way, he wanted her to be responsible for. Naomi knew what this was. It was not about discomfort. It was about punishment. She had not played the role they had expected. So now they would make her feel unwelcome in her own seat. The third consequence came in words. Spoken just loud enough for her to hear. Across the aisle, the old man in 25B was speaking again. His voice low but deliberate. This country used to have rules. He wasn't looking at her. But he wasn't talking to anyone else. Either. There was a way things worked. A way things were done. But now, everything's different. People think they can just do whatever they want. The woman next to him made a small sound of agreement. A passive hum. A small, sharp endorsement of something she would never say out loud. Naomi turned her head slightly. People like me? The words were soft. Too soft for accusation. Too firm to be ignored. The old man finally met her eyes. His expression was unreadable, a careful mask built over decades. And yet, for the first time, he did not have an answer. The truth sat between them like an unwelcome guest, refusing to be ignored. Then came the final consequence. The moment she had known was coming all along. The plane had begun its descent. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting trash, preparing the passengers for landing. And then, a voice. A familiar one. David Langston. He had come from the front of the plane, where he had spent the flight tending to first-class passengers, where he had not had to think of Naomi Carter since he had denied her the seat she had paid for. But now, here he was, and he was walking toward her. He stopped at her row. His face was carefully neutral, but Naomi could see the tension in his jaw. She met his eyes, steady, waiting. "Sergeant Carter," he said. Voice controlled, clipped. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Naomi did not blink. She did not look away. She did not move. She had already spoken. She had already made her choice. And if Langston thought he could reclaim control of this moment, if he thought he could offer her some shallow reconciliation before she stepped off this plane, he was mistaken. "No, thank you," she said. A flicker of something. Annoyance. Disbelief. Perhaps even anger. Crossed his face. He had expected gratitude. Or at least compliance. And yet, here she was. Unmoved. Unshaken. Unapologetic. For a moment, the tension thickened. Stretched between them like something tangible. And then, finally, Langston exhaled. He gave a curt nod. And without another word, he walked away. The plane landed. Passengers gathered their things. Moved into the aisle. Prepared to return to their real lives. Naomi did not rush. She sat still as the people around her reached for their bags. As they avoided her gaze. As they whispered their last whispers. Then, and only then, she rose. She slung her duffel bag over her shoulder. She stepped into the aisle. And she walked forward, past the man who had shifted away from her. Past the old man who had lost his words. Past the flight attendant who had refused to serve her. Past all the people who had chosen silence when they could have chosen something else. She walked toward the exit. Toward the door that led her off this plane. Out of this space. And back into the world that had shaped her. The battle had been small. But it mattered. Because the war was not fought in grand moments. Not in speeches. Not in courtrooms. Not in headlines. It was fought here. In places where people believed no one would notice. In the silence that tried to erase you. In the choice to sit still. When the world expected you to move. Naomi Carter had made her choice. And as she stepped off the plane, she knew. They would not forget it. The jet bridge was colder than she expected. The air had changed. Less recycled. More real. But the weight in Naomi Carter's chest had not lifted. The faces around her shifted from passengers to airport staff. from those who had borne witness to those who would only hear about it in whispers. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, stepping forward with the same practiced discipline that had carried her through war zones. Through bureaucratic offices that had not wanted her there. Through this country that had demanded her service but never quite her presence. She had left the plane. But she had not left the battle. Because the truth was, there was no other side of the door. The war did not end when the wheels touched the ground. It only changed form. The first reminder came at the terminal. The other passengers moved swiftly past her, eager to claim their luggage, to resume their lives, to leave behind the plane and all that had happened in it. Naomi, however, was forced to stop. Security officers stood near the gate. 2 white men in dark uniforms, their eyes scanning the crowd. She saw it before it happened. She had lived it too many times not to recognize the signs. One officer elbowed the other. A nod in her direction. They were speaking into radios before she even reached them. She knew what came next. "Ma'am, could you step aside for a moment?" The second reminder came in the questioning. The space they led her to was not an interrogation room. It did not need to be. A row of chairs. A desk. A second officer standing just behind the first. Power was an unspoken thing. It moved in the way the first officer leaned forward. Hands clasped. It moved in the way the second officer did not sit. Did not blink. Did not break the image of a man prepared to escalate if the moment required it. Naomi stood still. She had been trained for this. She had survived worse. Routine security check. The officer said, "Just a few questions." She nodded once. Silent. She let them ask her name as if they had not already seen it on her ID. She let them ask about her flight as if they had not already known. She let them pretend this was about something other than what it was. Because she knew. This was punishment. This was the cost of her refusal. They had seen what had happened on that plane. Or maybe someone. Langston, the old man in 25B. The flight attendant who had refused to look at her. Had made sure they knew. Because nothing challenged power more than a black woman who refused to bend. So here she was. They could not put her back in the coach. They could not deny her the seat she had paid for. Not now. Not again. But they could do this. They could make her stand. They could make her wait. They could make her feel the weight of their authority. Naomi exhaled slowly. She had waited before. She could wait again. The third reminder came in the waiting. It was always waiting. It was a weapon, sharper than words, heavier than threats. Time stretched in spaces like these. Bending, coiling, reminding her that she was at their mercy. And not the other way around. They took her ID. Disappeared with it. She did not ask when they would return. She did not ask what they were checking for. She had earned clearance long before this moment. She had worn the uniform of a soldier for longer than either of these men had likely held their jobs. She had stood at checkpoints in foreign countries, assessing threats, securing civilians, standing between war and peace. And yet here she was. In her own country, in her own airport, being made to prove something to men who had never once stepped onto the battlefield. It was almost laughable. But Naomi did not laugh. She stood. She waited. She breathed. Because she would not give them anything to hold against her. Not one word. Not one sigh. Not 1 ounce of her frustration. She had already given enough. Then came the final reminder. The one she had seen coming from the beginning. The officer returned. He held out her ID. "We're all set here," he said. No apology. No explanation. Because there was no need. Because this had never been about procedure. It had been about a lesson. A final attempt to remind her where she stood. Naomi took her ID. She did not nod. She did not thank him. She turned. She walked away. Because that, in the end, was the only fight that mattered. Not to stand in their spaces, pleading for their approval, but to leave them behind. To walk forward. To keep moving. The airport opened before her. Beyond the security line, she saw a familiar figure waiting. A woman, mid-50s, dark skin, standing with the quiet grace of someone who had lived through too much to be surprised by any of it. Her mother. Naomi stepped toward her, and for the first time since she had entered this place, the weight in her chest began to ease. Because here, In the presence of her own. She did not have to explain. She did not have to justify herself. She could simply be. Her mother's arms were open. Naomi stepped into them. And as the weight of the day finally left her shoulders, she realized they had never been strong enough to break her. Naomi Carter had learned, long ago, that coming home was never as simple as stepping through a door. It was a different kind of battlefield. The kind where wounds did not bleed but still ached. Where enemies did not wear uniforms but still knew their orders. She had fought her way across the ocean. Across borders. Across lands where she was both feared and needed. But it was here, in her own country, in her own airport, that she had faced the sharpest blade of all. The one that never cut deep enough to kill but always left a scar. The kind of wound that did not heal. The kind of wound that simply became a part of you. The first weight came in the walk through the airport. She moved past travelers who had not been stopped. Past men who had walked freely through security. Past women who had never been asked to step aside. She did not rush. She would not give them the satisfaction. But she saw the way some of them looked at her. Not with fear, not with curiosity, with knowing. They had seen what had happened. They had watched. And yet, none of them had spoken. It was a silence she knew well. Not the silence of ignorance. But the silence of those who had decided long ago that this was not their fight. She walked past them anyway. Because, in the end, she had never needed them. The second weight came on the drive home. Her mother's hands were steady on the wheel. Eyes forward, voice quiet. She had not asked what had happened. She did not need to. She had lived it long before Naomi had. She had been told to move. She had been asked to step aside. She had been denied things without reason. Except for the reason that no one had dared to say out loud. And she had survived it. Which meant Naomi would, too. The third weight came in the house. The house her father had built. The house where she had first learned the meaning of war. His picture still hung in the living room. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Carter. A black man who had flown in wars that did not want him. Who had saved men who would not have sat next to him in a diner. Who had been cheered overseas and spit on when he returned. He had been called a hero. And he had been made to wait. For respect. For dignity. For a country that had always seemed just a little too slow to acknowledge men like him. And now, his daughter had been made to wait. Too. She sat down on the couch. Exhaling slowly. Staring at the framed medals on the wall. Her father had won battles. But had he ever won the war? Had she? Would she? Then came the final weight. The realization that there was no end to this fight. The battles did not close with victory. They did not wrap up neatly. They only shifted, changed names, changed faces, found new ways to remind people like her that they would never be free. Not completely, not without a price. And yet, here she was, still standing, still breathing, still moving forward. Because if there was one thing she had learned from her father, from her mother, from every ancestor who had walked through fire and still refused to burn, it was that history did not end with them. The war was never just theirs to fight. It was hers now, too. And she would not lose. Not today. Not ever. She leaned back, letting the weight settle, but not letting it sink her. Because tomorrow, there will be another battle. And she would be ready.